Josh Lewenberg, our Raptors reporter, was on the scene at the Scotiabank Arena yesterday for the monumental comeback. Josh is with us now. Josh, how are you?
I'm doing well, Jim. Dave, how you guys doing?
Good.
Well.
Is the jaw okay? Because I'm sure it dropped at some point yesterday.
Yeah, who would have thought, right? I mean, a Sunday afternoon, you barely have any players left in the lineup. They had 10 guys available. Many of them were end-of-the-bench players that had barely seen meaningful minutes this year. The big names out of the lineup, obviously Pascal Siakam, Marc Gasol, Norman Powell. And then on the other side of things, same sort of situation. No Luka Doncic. Otherwise, a game against the Dallas Mavericks, who have been really good this year, would have been kind of exciting and something to get up for. But no, Luka took some of the excitement out of the game. And then that third quarter, I mean, it sucked the life out of the building. And even myself and everybody else on press row, like, I'm paying attention to the NFL and my finals in my fantasy football league, and my attention is drifting. And then all of a sudden, you see, okay, well, the Raptors, they're putting on this full-court press. That's interesting. They're doing this for a bunch of possessions in a row. They're cutting the lead down, and all of a sudden you're paying more and more attention until they get it down under 10, and it's realistic. And then it goes from being realistic to being a reality. It was surreal, and yet another iconic moment for the Raptors in a 12-month, 14-month span that has produced a ton of iconic moments.
I mean, when you look at this is just a win in the standings, but does it feel like this is kind of one that you might look back on at some point in the year and say, boy, you know, any doubts that this team had about itself were addressed, you know, on December the 22nd?
Yeah, I think it did a few things. I mean, Nick Nurse made a very good point after the game that as long as he's been around, remember, it's been a while now. He was an assistant coach under Dwayne Casey, the head coach now for a year and a half. As long as he's been around, and it's been for most of this, I like to call it the We the North era, that's been a quality that this Raptors team has had. They've fought hard. They very rarely come out and completely get blown out. They're always showing that competitiveness, the underdog spirit and all of that. But I do think this was an important moment because of the context. I mentioned a bunch of it earlier. Is you've got three guys out of the lineup. You're banged up, you're undermanned, and that very easily could have been a turning point in the other direction. And that's sort of where my mind was at in the third quarter is you're getting blown out. Your offense at that point was a disaster. Like they had nothing going on offensively. They were pretty bad defensively in the third quarter as well. But the offense is the major concern. You're missing your leading scorer in Siakam, your hottest scorer in Powell, and a guy in Marc Gasol who does so much to facilitate the offense with his passing and IQ and screen setting and all of that. And you don't know when any of those guys are coming back. They're all out indefinitely. You look at the Eastern Conference race right now, and it's so tight. Mm-hmm. There's one game separating second from sixth. And you can't really afford any of those teams. You can't really afford to go on a losing streak or have a rough patch for a few weeks. And that's what the Raptors were facing, and they're still facing it. But that's sort of where I'm going with this is I think all of a sudden you get this win and you have this comeback, and I think it's a moral victory as much as it's an actual victory because it proves to them that they can continue to win games. They can, at minimum, tread water while these guys are out, and I think it's really good for their confidence, especially for the young guys that were on the floor for that comeback. It was Lowry and then a bunch of players who don't have a lot of experience in the NBA, and a run like that, a comeback like that, I think does a lot to boost those guys and their confidence in what they're capable of doing.
There's a transition here that I think is pretty rare. And so last year in the playoffs, when the Raptors were in a spot of trouble or the game was on the line, you would learn to look at Kawhi and see how he would lead the team. Yesterday, when you're down by 30, what you would see on the court was if a mistake was made, the players would look at each other and acknowledge the mistake and understand that it was being corrected. That type of on-court chemistry, I mean, you're down 30 points, most teams disintegrate. They were still working on it. I mean, that's really impressive, isn't it?
Right. Well, it was two things that sparked the run. I think, first of all, it was the defense, and that's something we've talked about this over the last few weeks as well, is that was an identity that was built in the playoffs, specifically after that Game 1 loss against Orlando, is where, if you ask them, they say they really found themselves as a defensive-minded team. The defense really fell off in the third quarter, and yeah, the offense was a disaster all day, but once they were able to get things together defensively, and it really started once they put on that full-court press and really started to force turnovers and put pressure on Dallas, that's when they really sparked that comeback. But the second thing, of course, is Kyle Lowry. You mentioned Kawhi, and this is who they turn to now, Kyle. And maybe that's who they've always turned to, even with Kawhi Leonard around, because Kawhi, as we know, is a little bit quieter and he led by example, and he was certainly the best player on the team. But Lowry's always been the most vocal leader. He's a guy that, for all of his occasional crustiness and his strong personality, guys love to play with him. I've never heard a teammate say anything bad about him. He's a guy that over the years has become such a great leader, and somebody who, I know we always talk about Lowry and the bench units, and that's what we saw last night, is how much he really propped up that unit of reserves, but he's a guy that generally makes everybody he plays with better, and generally makes every unit he plays with better. So I think that was the biggest thing last night, is those other guys were really feeding off of him and his experience, and just being on the floor gives those young guys a sense of calm and confidence that they probably wouldn't have with anybody else running the point.